Last week we talked about the bryozoans, which are the only biomineralizing phylum that have not been recorded in the Cambrian. But I did give some caveats to that because of a recent paper, and some other ones in the past as well, but particularly a recent paper on a thing called Protomelission, which is being argued to be an early Cambrian bryozoan. Let's have a close look, and then go hunting bryozoans throughout the Cambrian and see what we're left with. Hello everyone. Summer has suddenly arrived in the UK and we're predicted to be something like 32 or 33 Celsius in the middle of Wales today and tomorrow. This is unexpected, but we'll make the most of it and hopefully, if we can handle it, get out to the quarry at some point and do some more collecting. But in the meantime, I've had a few days off. I've had a lovely few days visiting friends and, just relaxing, which seems like the first time in months. Which means I'm all sort of fresh and ready for more bryozoans. If you're new to bryozoans, then have a look at that other video that I just done, which introduces all of the basics about them. And one of the most interesting things about them in some ways is the fact that they are the only biomineralized phylum, at least partly biomineralized, that doesn't have a fossil record in the Cambrian that is well agreed upon. So that's not to say there haven't been candidates, and some of them have not stood up to scrutiny and others may have done. But there's a recent paper which has been in the news a little bit, which seems to be showing pretty conclusively, at least so the press release goes, that you do indeed have early Cambrian bryozoans belonging to a recognisable modern group. Now that's interesting. And so what we're going to do today is have a look through this paper to start with, and then think about the implications, because if they're there in the early Cambrian, where are they for the rest of the Cambrian? So we need to look also at the other candidate bryozoans that have been put forward and see what we make of them as well. And then come back to what it all means. What does it mean for the completeness of the fossil record, for example? What does it mean for how much we can trust the absence of evidence when it comes to a major phylum that should leave quite a good trace behind? And are there caveats that might be reasons why it doesn't leave any trace behind? So lots to consider. But firstly, let's get into this new paper. The paper is about a thing called Protomelission. Now, this is a genus that has a little bit of a controversial history. It was described in 2021 by quite a long list of authors, including many of the same authors as the current paper, led by Zhang Zhiliang. And this was described in 2021 as a potential stem group bryozoan from the early Cambrian of Australia. It's a single species. The only one known of Protomelission is P. gatehousei. And it was nicely preserved material. And it does indeed look like bryozoan. But there wasn't that much fine detail preserved in it. So it was slightly ambiguous, and it was proposed as a potential stem group bryozoan, which had a few features that maybe didn't fit into the modern classes. Then it was reinterpreted as an alga. This was based on comparisons with Chinese material, which are sort of vaguely similar and reasonably closely similar in some ways, but significantly larger. But just looking at similar structural features, another set of authors came along and said that that's actually an alga, not bryozoan at all. That didn't last long, though, because sometime after that, it was redescribed as a cambroclave, an articulated array of sclerites of an enigmatic organism where we only know the isolated sclerites before, but is quite widely known in early Cambrian rocks. And this was reconsidered to be an articulated part of the sclerotome of one of these cambroclave organisms, which might be related to ecdysozoans, possibly, so something to do with paleosqueleton worms, something like that, but nobody's quite sure what cambroclaves are, and this became the best evidence for what cambroclaves might be, because articulated material. So you've got bryozoans, algae, and cambroclaves. So that is two of the major divisions of animal life and one division of not animal life. That's all in recent papers. This isn't some outdated work. This is stuff that has been done in the last few years. And there was so much ambiguity over it that you can fit them into any of those groups. So more material was needed. And more material is exactly what we've got. So the new paper is being published in Nature by a very high-profile group of authors led by Baopeng Song, and also including most of the list of the 2021 paper, including people like Zhang Zhiliang, Junior Ma, Glenn Brock. These are all quite good names. I mean, I'm slightly biased because I work with Ma Junior quite a lot in China. He's my main collaborator out there. But this is a good bunch of people. Lars Homer's there as well. There's a lot of well-known names. That, of course, does not mean anything by itself. You can't just go by the names and say, well, these are famous people, therefore it's right. So we're going to have a look at this paper and be unbiased and impartial, because you know what I'm like with news stories. I normally come along and say, yeah, but no. So, high-fidelity modular skeletons authenticate a Cambrian origin for bryozoa. So this is actually two genera, Protomelission and then a new one, with specimens found in the Xinudong formation of Shanxi, this is North China, and they are from the early Cambrian, and they are phosphatized, so secondarily phosphatized. Now, this is an important point, because it's something that we get quite a lot in particularly early Cambrian rocks, also late Cambrian, a few other isolated bits here and there, but mainly Ediacaran to early Ordovician. And phosphatization is an extraordinary chemical replacement process that seems to have had a very restricted temporal range. We don't fully understand the processes that went on with it, but it seems to have been the case that in some environments, calcium phosphate replaces both calcium carbonate and potentially, in some cases definitely, soft tissues as well. So when we see phosphatized fossils, from the early Cambrian especially, we often don't know whether they were originally made of calcium carbonate or something organic like chitin. In some cases, it is actually replacing purely soft tissues. So in the Ediacaran, there are embryos, probably not of animals in most cases at least, but embryos, preserved in 3 dimensions by phosphate. So it is an extraordinary process that can preserve very fine detail and is extremely important in understanding the early fossil record. But it's slightly enigmatic, and quite often it destroys some of the original mineralogy if there was any there. So what I'm saying is that we don't actually know whether these fossils that we're describing here were made of calcium carbonate, whether they were bimineralized or whether they weren't. They may have been purely organic. That's just hard luck, really, because we'd really like to know, as we'll come on to later, whether these were bimineralized or not. But what have we actually got here? There's a lot of detail. Even at first glance, you can see this is really, really nice material. It matches the description of the original Protomelission gatehousey with these sort of interlocked array of rounded hexagonal units, but we've got much more detail here of the structures surrounding these sort of apertures in the wider end of it. It's also in 3 dimensions and beautifully 3-dimensional, and so much so they've used X-ray tomography in this paper to look at the internal structure, and that has yielded some remarkable extra structures. You can see the internal organization of this thing, which again looks exactly like you would expect if this was interpreted as bryozoan. So that is really, really nice. This is the sort of thing that you could almost be looking at a modern bryozoan here. It's pretty convincing, even at first glance. You'll notice that the the upper surfaces of these units have these sort of ragged edges and lots of little striae or little ridges which are a little bit irregular, almost as if this was a soft structure. And it does look like this is a phosphatized organic membranous structure, just like you get covering the zoecia in these encrusting or mat-like bryozoans that we have today. It's really quite compelling, even when you first see these images. I mean, you see that in any time other than the Cambrian, or the early Cambrian, or the Ediacaran, or something like that, and you would say that that's clearly bryozoan. They can do better than that, though, because there are multiple species. We've got the second one as well, which they've described as Protomelission hexaclitia, which is a new genus and species based on this hexagonal array structure, which is quite interesting. And it's slightly different to the other one. It doesn't have the same sort of architecture with these covered walls, but this looks more like an encrusting form rather than a sort of freestanding one. And it's a sort of unilaminate colony, they call it. So this is basically a single sheet with single sort of units divided by quite well-constructed solid walls. And within these walls, there are these sort of vertical rods, which is an interesting feature because these are a feature also of bryozoans. They're known as styles, and they are used to support or create these colony wall structures. The microstructure of the colony wall as well is, when you look in very high resolution imaging, what do they use for that one? That is 500 micron scale bar in this last image here. So this is getting quite small, but it's exactly the same sort of architecture of these little granular units arranged in rows, which you would expect for bryozoan. And then again, when you look in more detail at particularly Protomelission, well, actually for both of them, you start seeing structures which are clearly soft tissue. So in Protomelission, you have this membranous structure which is covering over the surface, except for the aperture where the zooid would have extruded its tentacles, and it's lophophore, sorry. And you have here a really beautiful sort of organisation of what they're calling, or preservation of the membranous sac, which is a sort of a thin organic structure that the zooid would have been living inside. And yeah, you don't normally see this fossilized in Paleozoic bryozoans at all, because this is a soft tissue structure. But it gets even better with the other one, where you can see this membranous sac is actually a sort of lining, which is separated from the skeletal wall. And that, again, is exactly the sort of organisation you would expect to see in a bryozoan. So we've got the ultrastructure, the microstructure of the body wall of these things. We've got the soft tissue arrangement of the membranous sac that was infilling or just lining the units of the skeletal colony. You've got the styles making up the colony wall of one of these species. You've got the structure, the form of these rounded, elongate tubular things in which the animals would have lived. It's remarkably complete evidence. It's better evidence than you tend to get in most Paleozoic bryozoans, which are just completely accepted because they're bryozoans, and you don't have any surprise at seeing bryozoans there. So from looking at this, my verdict is, yeah. I mean, how can it not be? I mean, it's always possible that there's some extreme convergence going on with something else, but here we've got so many elements that you would want to see in a real bryozoan from the early Cambrian that I have got nothing. I can't argue that one. Well done, folks. You got bryozoan. That said, I'm sure someone else will write a rebuttal paper one day or come up with an alternative explanation, but as far as I can see, this actually looks very sound indeed. It's a much, much bigger step up than the first description of Protomelission, where you had relatively little fine detail. And it looked like bryozoan, but without the anatomical detail, you couldn't prove it. Here, they've actually got some of that anatomical soft tissue detail with the membranous sacs especially, and they've got microstructure, and they've got the styles. Yeah, as far as I can tell, that is indeed a bryozoan in the early Cambrian. So this is extending the known range of bryozoans back by about 35 million years. Was it biomineralized? Well, we don't know from the fossils themselves. But can we guess? We probably can. And the authors have also taken this a step further, as you kind of have to, and done a phylogenetic analysis of these fossils, a cladistic analysis, where you create a data matrix of known bryozoans, include the coded data matrix of the new genera, stick them in, and see where it falls out. And so they have presented this, which is, well, I don't have the skills to assess whether this is a really rigorous and reliable analysis. It's just not my skill set, but I have no reason to doubt it. And what we've got here is a phylogenetic data set that reconstructs the main different groups of the bryozoans. So they've got the outgroups in bright orange here. The phylactolomata are universally, I think, now accepted to be the earliest branching group of modern bryozoans, and they do indeed come out at the base. Actually, no, it's all an unresolved polycotomy there, but it's genetics that is separating out the phylactolomata first in the modern ones. So basically, you've got all three of the main classes coming off the one branch where there's no clear separation, but we've got the gymnolomata over here, and the rest is the stenolomata, which is the great majority of fossil bryozoans because they all have calcareous skeletons and they have this abundant record through the Paleozoic. And these two new genera turn up in the stenolomata, which is really interesting. And this is supported by several anatomical characters, they say. You can point to specific features that are shared with the stenolomata, but not with the other groups. And this is fairly compelling, that it's turning up when you code them up according to the characters of known bryozoans, not only within the bryozoan tree, but within a known group of bryozoans. So this is actually argued to be evidence that these things are not only bryozoans, but stenolomate bryozoans. Now, this is extremely interesting in all sorts of ways, because the stenolomata are, as far as we've known, exclusively biomineralized in calcite. The other groups, well, the gymnolomata are partly biomineralized in calcite, the phylactolomata are not. So you can have an assumption there that the original state of biomineralization in bryozoans was that they didn't have any. And then later on, it developed probably multiple times within the gymnolomata and especially near the base of the stenolomata, possibly within the stem group of the stenolomata, because all of the known members of that group have got a calcite skeleton. Which means that these two new genera are nested within a calcareous lineage, a calcareous group of bryozoans, and therefore there should be continuity of a calcite skeleton between the time that these existed and the Ordovician. So the whole of the Cambrian should have bryozoans, preservable bryozoans with calcite skeletons. It's also possible that you had multiple origins of calcification independently within the stenolomata, and this is retaining some sort of primitive character where it was just a chitinous skeleton and therefore less preservable. But the fact that you have already some quite extensive diversification of the major lineages within the stenolomata by the early Cambrian kind of implies that even if this was somehow preserving a primitive character of not having a biomineral skeleton, other groups you would expect to have been there at this time should have had a calcite skeleton. Which is really interesting, because it tells us there's a whopping great hole in our fossil record. Or is there? Because there has been so much controversy over potential Cambrian bryozoans that they have, as they have had to be, been treated with a certain amount of skepticism when possibilities for Cambrian bryozoans have turned up. And there have been some. So let's have a look at some of these, because some are quite compelling and others are not. There's not a huge number of them, but we'll go through a few. So there is, for example, a paper from 2022 by Sarah Pruss and others, including Paul Taylor, who is one of the gods of bryozoology, published in Science Advances, from the early Cambrian, the lower Cambrian rocks of Nevada in the USA. Now, this one is one that the specimens just look like bryozoans. They have a sort of massive colonies with numerous little tubes in them. They look very similar superficially to the sort of stuff that you get in the Ordovician and Silurian. And they are unfortunately lacking in the fine detail to prove it. That's the problem here. But we've got these sort of globose or elongate colonies which are made of a densely packed array of very fine tubes. Now, those tubes are very small, even for bryozoans, actually. The entire colonies here are something like 1 millimeter wide. But they are still structurally very, very similar to what you expect to see in limestones in later rocks for little bryozoans. And you see something like this, you might well think, yep, that's probably bryozoan. And they've done quite a lot of work of interpreting the branching patterns and shown that's the sort of thing you expect within bryozoan colonies. You get occasional divisions as the colony grows out from a central point, so the surface gets larger, so it branches. And it is composed of little tubes with thin calcite walls. They're in limestone, and they are from an environment which is quite interesting. They are in limestones associated with or just above archaeocyathon reefs. Now, I know quite a few of you know about archaeocyathons. I haven't done a video on them yet, but it's certainly on the list to do. They are sponges or sponge-like organisms which proliferated during the early Cambrian and formed reefs all over the world, and then very rapidly went extinct. So they had a very brief sort of time in the sun when they were the equivalent of corals. They created complex architectures, actual reefs with cavities and cavity-dwelling organisms living inside them. And associated with those reefs, you get various other things, including things like this. So there are also little true corals that you get there. There are sponges living inside the cavities. There are, of course, lots of brachiopod shells and other things living inside them. There are borings and burrows in the cavities and so on. There's lots of life going on inside these reefs. But we don't tend to have exceptional preservation. We don't see soft-bodied taxa in these reefs because the preservation is, well, the environment was too aerobic and too turbulent. So you don't tend to see anything like soft tissue detail here. The Burgess Shale type faunas are offshore in muddy environments, and occasionally you get an archaeocyath washed into those, but you don't see that community living in situ. So we're only seeing an imperfect fossil assemblage here, much as you get in the Ordovician, Silurian reefs and so on later on. So what you do get, though, is good preservation, at least reasonable preservation, of calcite skeletons. And that seems to be what they have here. It is a thing that looks like what they call paleostomate bryozoans. I'll need to just check what exactly paleostomates are, but it's obviously an early group. But they just look like bryozoans. but you can't prove it. So this paper was titled with a question mark, "The Oldest Mineralized Bryozoan, a Possible Paleostomate in the Lower Cambrian of Nevada." Now, given that we now know, assuming Protomelission and the other one are accepted, that bryozoans did exist at the same time, there is no reason not to interpret this as a bryozoan, at least tentatively. And I think probably it's one of those cases where the finding of proof for one actually then supports the evidence for the other. That said, could it be something like a tubular calcareous alga? It's very hard to rule it out categorically. There are potentially other possible interpretations for structures like this, but it looks so like bryozoan, even with the limited fidelity of the wall structure, the preserved calcite microstructure. Even with that, I think this looks actually reasonably convincing. It's a different morphology, but then the two in China are different morphologies as well. So it looks like there's actually quite a high diversity, if we accept this one, of body forms, of colony forms, even by the early Cambrian. And if this is biomineralized and the others are stenolamates, which should be biomineralized, at least in part, or their relatives should be, then it implies that there should be a lot of other bryozoans in the Cambrian as well. So let's see what else there is. Staying in the early Cambrian, this one is a preprint that Mulvlu has pointed out to me a while back, so thanks for that, of bryozoans allegedly from the Chengjiang biota. Now, of course, at Chengjiang you have exquisite soft tissues in all sorts of things, so you see something like this and you start getting interested. But this is a preprint. It has not gone through peer review, and I don't think that there's any sign of it coming out at the moment. So treat this as a proposal rather than something which is even partly supported scientifically, because nobody has published this yet, so we don't know what the bryozoan specialists think of it. And we have here two cyclostomes, they say, Panpipora and Corinotrippa. Corinotrippa is actually a known genus, and is it an extant one? I'll have to look that one up. I'll get back to you on that. But these are, well, actually, I shouldn't have said the name Panpipora because it is in a preprint and it is not zoobank registered. There's no clarification of that, which means that that name is taxonomically invalid. It doesn't exist and it shouldn't be used until it is formally published and registered in zoobank. So, yeah, unnamed bryozoan. But let's have a look at these images, because that's always what we're most interested in, is the pretty pictures. And this is what we've got. So, right, so this is Corinotrippa, and these are the others. Right. Am I convinced by that? I don't know what I'm looking at here. This is an elongate object with radial lines and a sort of swelling in the centre. They have the look of mineral structures to me. Yeah, I'm going to have to read this one. Then you also have this other one, which is apparently a sort of branching black organic material structure, and there are little blobs on the surfaces. Now, it's branching, but the branches are of very irregular widths, and some of them just seem to stop. They do have more detail of this, and you zoom into this sort of area, and the branches are actually shown to be ridges, with the pale bits apparently being the crests of the ridges, I think. And then there are tiny little structures on the surfaces which have pores or tubes or something in. They are made of looks like an aluminium silicate, so it's sort of clay minerals, or at least that's what's being recorded by the EDX analysis with SEM. I don't like this one. I think this is simply a ridged, slightly cracked organic sheet. Probably something like a fragment of arthropod or something like that, which has cracked in such a way that it looks as though there are branching structures in there, but those branches are not regular enough. And the fact that it is ridged like that, rather than being separate branches, it's very peculiar. I am not convinced by that at all. The previous one, I'm just not sure what I'm looking at. This is a strange thing, and it may well be that there are some bryozoans, Corynotrippa, that has some similarities to it. But I'm just going to check that. Give me a sec. Okay, so Corynotrippa is a Paleozoic genus, which is quite well known. It's an early cyclostome, sort of with runner-like or mat-like encrusting form. It's a common encruster on quite a lot of sort of hard grounds and shells and things like that, in the Ordovician especially. And I personally don't see the resemblance here at all. And they're arguing that little blobs here are actually zooids. And the little red arrows are pointing to lines which are the margin of the basal wall. Yeah, I think I'm going to not worry too much about this one until it's actually published and has been seen by a bryozoan specialist, which I am not. So it is possible that there are features here that I'm just not seeing as being significant, which actually are. But in my mind, this is not, in either case, at all convincing. And the new name, this new genus and species name, I don't think is actually going to end up being used. I doubt this will see the light of day in terms of a real publication, but we shall see. If it comes back again, I'll have a look at it then. So that was Chengjiang, but in the Guanshan, so slightly younger, this is going into the middle part of the Ordovician now, there is something which is potentially more interesting. Now, the Guanshan thing, it's in a paper with an unnamed Cnidarian as well, is a couple of encrusting structures on a bit of trilobite. So this is a trilobite sclerite, a piece of the skeleton lying on the seafloor, and it's got these rounded masses with a sort of interesting grooved, lumpy, dimpled texture on the surface. So it is something which was encrusting onto a hard surface, as bryozoans do. It doesn't have anything like a regular sort of colony architecture with hexagonal zooecia or anything like that. It's much, much less regular than that. And it somehow has the appearance of something soft. But of course, the Guanshan biota is one of the Burgess Shale type faunas. It's quite a good one. And there is a lot of potential for soft body preservation. There's some pyrite going on in the preservation of a lot of these fossils. And yeah, so something like this, it just doesn't have enough information to be sure, but it looks to me rather like you would expect there to be. Oh yeah, in the external mould there is a bit more in the way of sort of pseudo-hexagonal sort of pores on the upper surface. They are calling it an unnamed bryozoan-like metazoan, and that is plausible. It looks like it might be bryozoan-like, and if it is bryozoan, then of course it's metazoan. My concern would be, can you rule out some sort of microbial or fungal colony or something like that living on the surface, which has been pyritized, oxidized, and you're left with this sort of slightly lumpy, squidgy thing without much fine detail. So of all the possible candidates, I would think that bryozoan is actually a pretty good guess on this one. It's not necessarily convincing, not necessarily compelling, but given how little there is to go on, I'd say, to my mind, maybe plausible. One to have on the list of reserves, if you like. You can't use this to confirm a certain type of bryozoan was there, but you can say that if it is a bryozoan, then it shows there's more diversity again. And my guess would be either something like a phylactylomat, which is sort of some mostly soft-bodied sort of structure, or it's something which was originally mineralized but has been very poorly preserved, mostly dissolved, and just seeing a sort of overgrowth of thamboids or pyrite or something like that, which are then oxidized and leaving you this sort of lumpy structure. But it's another interesting one. Now, another one which has received some attention over quite a few papers is Pywackia. This is going into the late Cambrian now, and this is from Mexico, from the Tinu Formation. So this is an area I don't know well at all, but it's acid dissolution, and it has generated interesting looking fossils that kind of look like this. And so you've got organic structures. I think these must be organic based on their appearance in SEM. And they have a sort of reticulate set of depressions on the surface of them with little narrow walls between. And you can look at this and see why people might think plausibly bryozoan. So it has been suggested to be bryozoan, but this paper is the latest of a series by Hagemann and Olev Vin in 2023, where they come to the conclusion that it is definitely not a bryozoan, it's a Cnidarian. And this is based on the microstructure, the actual organization of the body wall itself, of the colony structure. And from what I can see, this is actually pretty compelling. There's actually a lot of fine detail in here, and it looks like it is exactly like you would expect for a soft coral. Just check. Apparently, they're not assigning it to a particular class, but it is to Cnidarians based on the growth patterns and the microstructures of the skeleton. So there we have it. That is a tour of most of the most plausible, including some that actually aren't in hindsight, examples of Cambrian bryozoans out there. And yet, by the time you get into the early Ordovician, they're making reefs. So you have apparently now evidence for diverse forms of bryozoans, diverse colony forms, different groups, including the Stenolomata, in the early Cambrian. There should be biomineralized things there in the early Cambrian as well. And it looks like there may have been there in the Guanshan as little encrusting things, but the rest are much less convincing. And we're just left with this little sort of window in the early Cambrian where we have particularly the small shellies, but also the Archaeocyathon reefs, which again declined in the early Cambrian. And then they sort of disappeared effectively for most of the Cambrian, and then you start getting microbial type reefs and sponge reefs and things like that turning up in the Ordovician. There are some sponge reefs in the Cambrian as well, but it takes a long time for an ecology similar to the Archaeocyathon reefs to re-establish itself, and that really happens later in the Ordovician. So how could we possibly explain the bryozoans appearing and diversifying in the early Cambrian and then vanishing for pretty much all the Cambrian after that, with the odd possible hint of them later, until they reappear in abundance during the Ordovician? Now, if they genuinely were biomineralized during the early Cambrian, and this was the same biomineralization event as we had for the later forms, that it should be continuous. You have members of the same biomineralized lineages going from the early Cambrian all the way through, then you can't argue easily against a simple taphonomic argument that that these things were purely chitinous or soft-bodied, and therefore they weren't fossilized in the Middle and later Cambrian. That doesn't really make sense. And it's possible that they were independently biomineralized. It was a little experiment which died out, and then it biomineralized again in the Ordovician. But if you've got stenolamates in the early Cambrian, that shouldn't be the case, that you've got already the diversification of a major biomineralized group. So at that point, you'll have to start looking at other arguments. Now, the loss of the Archaeocyath reefs may be a significant thing, that there just wasn't the right sort of habitats, the right ecologies for these things to proliferate through the rest of the Cambrian. It may be they had to wait a bit, clinging on in little corners here and there where you had more or less the right conditions before you got an opportunity for them to appear en masse in the fossil record. And ecology is always a huge factor in paleontology. Interpreting the history of a group is difficult because we can only interpret it based on what is fossilized. And if there is a difficult set of ecological conditions for a group, then they're not going to be abundant. They're going to be there, potentially, if they survive at all, but in very low numbers. And we see this all over the place. We see Lazarus taxa, things that appear to go extinct in a mass extinction, and then they pop up 10, 15 million years later, having left no trace before that. We see it in the modern, things like the coelacanths, for example, large group of fish that were quite common until about the Jurassic, then they vanish, and then they turn up again, or was it Cretaceous? Yeah, Mesozoic, and then they turn up again in the deep sea. The monoplacophilon mollusks, these are things that have an abundant record until the Devonian and then vanish from the fossil record until they turned up alive in the deep sea. So it is quite possible for things to hide from the fossil record, entire groups with a biomineral skeleton, for a long time. Usually, though, that's in the deep ocean. And with bryozoans, which are adapted to conditions with an ambient water flow, they seem to thrive in shallow water. It's difficult to argue that these things were living in the deep sea in most of the Cambrian, but not in the shallows. So you're looking instead for other ecological arguments, such as potentially rarity. A bit like these Lazarus taxa, you get really hit hard by a mass extinction. And don't forget, there was a bit of a mass extinction in the early Cambrian, the Sinsk crisis, which we've looked at once or twice before. At least it's been mentioned. And this was a time when the Archaeocyathans and their reefs disappeared. There was a mass extinction of these shallow water communities in the early Cambrian. And it may be that that also hit the bryozoans, perhaps directly as well as through loss of habitat. In which case, you can imagine them clinging on in very turbulent shallow water environments where there are hard surfaces, such as pebbles and rock faces, that are not fossilized because they're in a zone of erosion. So modern rocky seashores are zones of erosion. Things that live there get smashed to pieces, broken down into tiny bits of dust, and generally not fossilized. Occasionally things get washed out from there, and so, for example, periwinkles, little gastropods that are grazing on the algae on the rocks, they have pretty good fossil record because they get washed away by waves, storms, and so on, and buried in quieter water, in them sort of muddy environments. But the ones living in that habitat are not going to be preserved because that habitat is not preserved. And this is a major bias against things like barnacles, which have not a great fossil record. It does happen. You do get bits of them washed out again into places where they can be preserved, but you don't get barnacles generally in situ on a rocky shoreline unless you have something like rapid subsidence, earthquakes and so on, and a rocky shore sinking far enough that it can be covered by mud, or the sea level rising and changing the bathymetry of the sea floor dramatically. So there are ways of doing it, but it's unusual. And this is what I'm trying to get at. It looks like, with this new paper, Protomelission and this other new one are probably genuine bryozoans, which means that one from Nevada is probably a genuine bryozoan, which means you had quite a lot of diversification early on, and then they vanish. But they won't have vanished entirely. Obviously, they survived because we still have bryozoans, but they must have been probably reduced in abundance, in biomass, possibly in diversity as well, until the conditions became right for them again, until the sponge microbial reefs of the Ordovician started to develop in a much more spectacular way, giving them more habitats that they could then start to evolve and multiply in. So when you're looking at the evolution of a major group, it's often tied very tightly to the evolution of other groups that are living in similar habitats, or that they are interrelated with in order to create the habitats in which they can all thrive and multiply and diversify. And I think that's probably now what we're seeing in the history of bryozoans, that there was an early diversification as part of the Cambrian explosion. They evolved, they diverged into their separate classes, probably at the same time as all the other phyla. Their absence was just rarity. And then, since then, they had this crisis when the Archaeocyathon reefs disappeared, and then we've lost the preservational window for the phosphatic preservation, we've lost the environment that they were preserved in, and so it looks like they vanish. And if that can happen to an entire preservable phylum, just think what that is doing to most of the fossil record. I am not one of these people who goes around saying that the fossil record is rubbish, it's too incomplete to do anything with, we need to look at the genetics instead. I totally disagree with that point of view, because the genetics only gives you one or two angles. It doesn't tell you about the morphology of these things, it doesn't tell you about the diversification of them. We need the fossil record, and it is critical to understand the history of life. We need to put a lot of effort into understanding the fossil record of it. But that is not the same as trusting it absolutely, because we know there are biases, and we can look at these biases, we can understand these biases. It's not that we can dismiss the fossil record because it's biased. Paleontology is about not just the fossils, but the lack of fossils, the bits where they're missing, and understanding why that is the case, and therefore being able to say which bits of the fossil record are reliable, which bits we can say this is a genuine pattern about, and which bits we know that we're likely to be missing things. And especially when you go back to the earliest record of animals and back into the Ediacaran, that is where we need this understanding. We need this critical understanding rather than just dismissing it because we got these things, we haven't got everything else, it's the fossil record. We need explanations as to why bits of the fossil record would be missing. With the bryozoans, we kind of have that. And now that we know what to look for in the early Cambrian, I suspect we'll get quite a lot more turning up, particularly in Archaeocyath reefs. But we shall see. That's a prediction for you. If it doesn't happen, then it looks like bryozoans were really, really rare, even when they did diversify. But it looks to me as if we have an explanation, as a working hypothesis now at least, for the pattern of diversification that we see in bryozoans and why they're missing for so long. I'll leave it there. That's quite a long one, but it's a really interesting story and hope you enjoyed that. And I will get back to other things. I'm not quite sure what. I had a few ideas. Anyway, I'll come up with something. See you soon, and I'll look forward to all your comments, and thank you everyone for engaging and just watching the videos and joining me for this interesting journey of discovery. Bye for now.